Hey, everybody. Now we are live. This is David Rovix with another episode of Fifth Estate Live, which comes to you every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern, and it can be viewed live on the Facebook pages of Popular Resistance and Cable Community Radio here in Portland, Oregon, as well as on YouTube, Twitter, Twitch, VK, and LinkedIn. And then it also goes out in podcast form afterwards if you look for This Week with David Rovix, wherever you get your podcasts. And it is produced by Peter Werby of the Fifth Estate Editorial Collective. And Fifth Estate is a quarterly print magazine that also has a website, fifthestate.org. And the winter edition is the Anarchist Review of Books, and it's just out right around now, I believe, although it hasn't arrived in the mail yet, but at least for me, but maybe it's on its way, I believe. And today we're talking with Bursts from the Final Straw radio collective in Asheville, North Carolina, that puts out a fantastic weekly radio show and podcast that covers a whole lot of ground. And he's also involved with Anarchist Black Cross and is appropriately wearing a ski mask. Wonderful to have you here. Great to see you.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us. Yeah. And
it's kind of funny being on this side of the mic.
Yeah, when you're used to interviewing people, it's a whole different thing. Like, yeah, absolutely.
Be gentle.
Yeah. Be gentle. Well, I love the ski mask, first of all. Can I make a fashion comment, first of all? The ski mask is it's the best ski mask that's been on the show, I'm pretty sure we can say. Yeah.
I can see some competition's going to come out of this. So.
Well, Franklin Lopez, wins the prize for the best mask, probably. But I think that's, the ski mask is more sort of classic kind of, I've been really enjoying the fact that we have to now wear masks when going into the bank, because right. that used to be discouraged.
Yeah.
Can you talk about starting out with, can we start out with your activities with Anarchist Black Cross and with with prisoners? And I know, of course, that the situation with the most imprisoned nation on earth was dire well before the pandemic, but now during the pandemic we have massively increased rate of dying from COVID-19 among folks in the prisons who are then also facing all sorts of horrible lockdowns beyond what they normally have to deal with. And I wonder if you could just give us some overview or thoughts on either locally or nationally what's going on with prisons in the age of COVID.
Sure. Yeah. And again, thanks for having me on. I'm glad to be able to talk about this. I'm by no means the most informed person on this, but we do have guests on the show sometimes who call in from prison in various parts of the country, and they generally are asked about and want to talk about the conditions inside.
Just to tell our guests something. I mean, it was just your radio show, your podcast. You're interviewing prisoners pretty much every week, and right, this is like a weekly phenomenon, or at least there's certainly information about prisoners in every podcast, and so it's definitely something that you've been putting a lot of focus on in this collective for a long time here.
We're lucky enough to work with a lot of people that do really good abolitionist work and have a lot of contacts inside, and folks who are inside who are abolitionists. So about once a month, sometimes more, we'll end up getting a prisoner to call out, frequently from Ohio. Years ago, I think in 2014, we started doing support for Sean Swain, who's an anarchist prisoner who is incarcerated by the Ohio prison system, but currently held in Virginia through interstate transfer to punish him for, for messing with the administration on a regular basis, and lots of lawsuits and his publications. So we've been featuring audio from him most weeks. He's currently limited in his ability to communicate. He can do letters, but nothing else, because of one of the segments where he critiqued the school system and obviously jokingly, suggested that all the schools be burnt down in the United States. But yeah, so the people that run the ODRC don't really like that sort of humorous talk.
But, because free speech doesn't exist there. I mean, it's not like, if you said something like all the schools should be burned down outside of prison, then this is going to be interpreted as a free speech. As free speech, unless you're talking about a specific school and a time that you're going to burn it down, how you're going to burn it down, that kind of thing. Then then it's just free speech, but not for prisoners, right? It's a different.
Well, there is.
They're
I've
under
heard
different.
Sean argue, and I don't know the exact case law, but the Supreme Court has actually addressed the question of whether or not prisoners have free speech. And I think that you're right in terms of if they're advocating for a specific criminal act to be engaged in, then there is legal recourse to try to block that act and to punish the person because they're making a credible threat to the outside. However, talking about like schools in general should be destroyed. We should have a different form of educating our youth, of engaging the youth in this country, and of inculcation. But there has to for that Supreme Court to get brought into interview, or for there to be any sort of follow up on the legal rights of prisoners, you have to have administrators above the state level in Ohio or within the state level who actually give a crap about the rights of prisoners. That's happened before. But to get to the point, like we spoke this week with a prisoner at Toledo CI in Toledo, Ohio, David Easley, and he was also in communication with Time Magazine, helping them write a story. But the 20% of the prison staff had come down with COVID, and they had been replaced by National Guard troops doing the guarding inside. This is not a surprising situation because Ohio has shown over and over again that it doesn't care about its staff and it doesn't care about its prisoners. In this case, they weren't, besides the National Guard, transferring in prison guards from other places or making wide transfers, but you have guards who are coming in and out of the facilities in these rural places. They're like going back to the communities, going back to the churches, their families, their kids often go to school, and then they come back into the prison, which is, a very closed quarter facility. In this case, David made a point of saying that the air transfer system inside the prison actually is pretty good about pumping air outside. But honestly, if you've got a bunch of men or women or whoever like crammed into confined spaces, sharing cells with each other, there's going and a lack of sanitation, a lack of sanitary materials for cleaning cells, a lack of access to vitamins. All anyone in that prison, and he caught it himself and lost taste for a little bit. He's still recovering. Another person, Jason Goodlock, that we interviewed last year, is still on a ventilator from his bout with it. They've been given nothing to treat, besides ventilators, they've been given nothing to treat COVID in the prisons except for non-aspirin Tylenol and cough drops. So, what do you expect?
Even NPR has been reporting on the number of people dying in the prisons and on how tight the conditions are and how little ventilation there is and stuff like that. But what you never hear anybody in the corporate media talking about is the idea of just releasing them all. And this is and even and also just putting it into context. It's not even like such a completely far out radical idea. At least if you consider the fact that one of the first things Iran did, and of course Iran is not, it's not one of the countries that's usually upheld as right. And the first thing they did was release over 50,000 prisoners to prevent the spread of COVID inside the prisons. I mean, they still have a terrible problem with COVID, but it was a good effort, and nothing like that's been done here, right?
No, but well, I guess it depends on, I'm not sure if some states might have applied something like that. Ohio definitely has not. North Carolina, where I'm based, has not. There's been a lot of pressure at a state level, and the state government has declared at different points, we're going to do our best to decarcerate. The local jail in the county where I am has decreased their jail population by 50%, and the county has, and the police force and the sheriff's department and the county jailers have all agreed to not incarcerate people for certain crimes that aren't immediate harm against another person. So property crimes, low-level drug charges, things like that are leading to people getting tickets and eventually court dates, but they're not leading to people being put in prison. Obviously, this begs the question of like, okay, cool, you can afford to not put these people in prison. You say that they're not a big enough threat that you would endanger them to COVID on the inside. Why are they in there in the first place? Why can't this be structured in a way? Why can't our society be structured in a way where people aren't going away for minor property crimes that aren't actually harming another individual? It's just undermining, the private property system to some degree, or it's maybe bringing light to the fact that we have a problem with distribution of wealth in this society, and people are consciously and systemically being kept in under populations. But
The more egalitarian societies are one of the characteristic things in them, at least by my observation, is you hardly ever see a cop. Like in I don't know, something like Norway or even in the Republic of Ireland or any. I mean, there's terrible problems in those societies, but to the extent, not to the extent of here, where we're spending half of our city budgets on the police, which is a indication of this extreme inequality and what you do with such inequality, funding all
well,
these police.
we're a white supremacist settler colonial society that has its history in like ongoing genocides against populations for social control, and I think that that's the point's been made very well that police are an extension of that, as is the prison system into today's class society. But just to
And
point out though about the government at various levels making a decision to decrease prison populations. There was a lawsuit earlier this year that I think Marius Mason was contributing to, the anarchist ELF prisoner who's currently in Danbury, Connecticut. He wasn't able to actually benefit from this himself, but there was a federal judge had determined that prisons had to make an active effort to decarcerate, to decrease the possibility of people dying, especially people who were within like 3 months of their release, or people who had distinctive medical issues or were like elders, that they would be closer to release. And that forced Danbury CI, where Marius is at, to release some prisoners. He, however, because of the terrorism enhancements, was not able to make use of that himself. But so it like there are elements of government at various levels that are recognizing that this is a terrible situation and that other things could be done, but it's just there's not the political will to make it across the board. Sorry to cut you off though.
oh, not at all. No, that's Marius. I've been good friends with Marius since the '90s, and Peter as well. Peter Werby, the producer of this show, and we visited Marius in prison a couple of years ago in Danbury, as well as in Texas. And I grew up near Danbury and drove past that prison thousands and thousands and thousands of times without ever, of course, turning down that road, which you are not supposed to turn down unless you're visiting a prisoner. I guess I never occurred to me to just go there anyway. Otherwise, and Marius, one of the things that people out there may or may not, depending on whether they listen to your podcast much or not, they may or may not realize, like prisoners, even the prisoners who have, depending on their level of communication that they're allowed with the outside world, even if they're allowed some degree of communication, like in the form of letters and email, even they have, if they have access, for example, to music, it's only a selection of music chosen by Walmart's some kind of MP3 collection curated by Walmart. So of course, Marius, we've never been able to, play music together in any form since he's been imprisoned, and he's also a very good musician and has virtually no access to any kind of a musical instrument in there. But I wonder, I imagine, to me anyway, one of the positives about having a radio show that's not just a podcast is that you potentially can actually reach prisoners. And I wonder, can you talk about what that's like? And I know some of your listeners are imprisoned, I'm assuming, because you actually are on the airwaves, not just on the internet.
We actually don't get that much outreach from prisoners. And I know that there's 2 prisons right near here that should be able to get access to it. And I wish we did. I know that some of the shows on our radio station do. I think one of the things, at least locally, one of the reasons is because we're in the middle of Sunday. And so that might not be when, during the daytime around church time or whatever. That's part of our audience, is we're hoping to get people when they're leaving church and throw a little bit of sacrilege in their ears. But yeah, we haven't really gotten that much outreach. I think most of the times that we're in contact with prisoners, it's because someone who's on the outside has sent them letters about us, or a prisoner has passed on our contact information saying, hey, maybe these people can help you out. Occasionally when we have the time and the energy to transcribe some of our episodes, and sometimes listeners will do that for us, which is awesome. Because it takes so long to type all the words out. Those will get sent in to prisoners, but yeah. Mm-hmm. But that was definitely a hope. And we do work with some projects through Channel Zero Network and through other initiatives that have inside outside prison shows where they will like get requests, or they'll be able to do shout outs to people behind bars, or get people from behind bars to call in and leave a message, and then they'll play that over the air. I think that's beautiful when that can happen. I wish that we could do more
Yeah.
of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And since you mentioned the Channel Zero network, can you talk about that a bit for people that don't know? Because I mean, I think it's just the what can happen so easily is people are isolated from each other. I mean, even with the internet, there's always so many tendencies towards isolation, and I think social media, particularly Facebook and YouTube, and their algorithms are designed to isolate us, really, actually, and or either that or make us argue with each other. So any kind of efforts to sort of seize control of communication from Facebook and YouTube seems extremely important. And one of those things is, I think, this network where people get to find out that there's actually other like-minded programmers making programming of all kinds that's happening, and people can easily find out about it. It seems I could talk about that a bit.
Yeah, for sure. So Channel Zero Network started, I want to say maybe in like 2016. It was, uh, well, Submedia, so Franklin, who you
Ah,
talked to, and also It's Going Down had started producing their podcast at that point. And also Tim Soul, MC Soul, the anarchist hip hop artist who does Soulcast, which I'm going to talk to in a couple of hours too, also. But
great.
real sweet guy. But decided to basically create a platform where they could share each other's content, amplify each other, share resources, because it can get kind of lonesome out there. And also the idea of like, by cross promoting, we're working off of our strengths. All of us that work in the network bring our own perspectives and our own skill sets and our own voices, and sort of like methods to the project. So for instance, Coffee with Comrade, the main host of that, Pearson, mostly is like, he works in universities, has a lot of authors in, and also musicians and artists and film critic. It kind of feels like a classroom setting, but more decentralized and less like a teacher lording over you. Or let's see, Rebel Steps, based out of New York City, has folks that work with MAC, the Metropolitan Anarchist Coordinating Committee, that come on in these really tight and well produced episodes where they thematically talk through the process of passing truck.
As long as it doesn't
If you can hear
stop. Yeah, I heard that. As long as it's not okay. Nobody stopped. You didn't hear anybody opening the door, getting yeah.
Exactly. Like I got my go bag. I can go
Right.
anytime. It's great.
You got the mask on.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But so Rebel Steps does these very well curated episodes with discussions around certain issues. It's meant to be a second step for someone getting involved in activism or an anarchist engagement. So it might be around prisoner support. They'll talk to someone from NYC behind like Books Through Bars. I think they had Daniel McGowan on that. They'll talk to people from New York City ABC, talk to people from the base, talk to people who have been incarcerated about their experiences and what prisoner support means to them. And sort of the basic steps about how to get involved, how to be safe when choosing to write to a prisoner, not overpromising, holding your boundaries about what's comfortable, what's not comfortable, but also just building that relationship of solidarity. Or they'll talk about, they've done a lot of episodes around housing strikes and like tenant organizing in New York City, and a little bit with folks on the outside. We've got Subversion 1312 with Linda out of Brisbane. God, I hope it's Brisbane and not Melbourne. It's Brisbane. In Australia, we've got folks from A Radio Berlin, and who are also in the A Radio network with us, as well as folks from Dissident Island in London. We've got from Embers, based in Ontario, or so-called Ontario. And we're still growing. We just added the Maroon cast out of the Baltimore area with Sima Lee, which is a part of the Maroon movement, as well as Indigenous Action, based out of occupied Arizona, I believe. So we're just trying to, we figure that if we build a coalition of shared voices with shared values, each of us are bringing different experiences, different interests. It might be art, it might be activism, it might be prison stuff specifically, to the table and opening discussion, and hopefully bringing more folks to a rounded understanding and accepted understanding of, like, not accepted understanding, we don't have like an orthodoxy, but like an understanding of anarchism where they're not misinterpreting something like anarchist capitalism or national anarchism as actually being real things, you know.
Yeah, right. Not just yeah, right. Good.
Yeah.
And each episode of shows that from people who are involved with the network who do whatever their show is, there's always some kind of a sharing of a little cart about another show. So I mean, it's very much like I mean, on in BBC or NPR, they do the same thing, and I find out about some of the most interesting little podcast series from those kinds of little advertisements. So it seems it'd be a shame if we weren't doing the same thing,
Mm-hmm.
try to get the word out. What's been going on locally? I mean, I assume there's been a lot happening in terms of the protests over the course of the summer in your part of the world there in what we call Western North Carolina. But also, have the protests extended into around protesting around conditions in prisons or freeing prisoners? Because I'm hearing just so little about anything happening around prisons, as much as there's been so much going on in cities around the country around police violence. That's sort of like extending it to other aspects of the violence of the system, such as the prisons, the mass incarceration. Is there much going on around that?
I mean, early in the summer, there were definitely some car parade protests that were happening in various parts of the country around prisons, including, I remember hearing about big ones around ICE facilities, and the Cook County Jail in Chicago. There were some in central North Carolina, around Raleigh. There were, I think, 3 or 4 protests that happened in a very short period of time. It seems like most of the people that are on the outside doing protests aren't necessarily showing up to facilities to try to um, to air their grievances. And I mean, it can be a lot to like sit in the car for like 6 hours and then go and protest for a few, driving around and honking and then like drive out back to wherever you came from. So I think that's a limitation. I know that when we've participated in stuff in other parts of the state, it's been pretty difficult not wanting to stop on the way, not being able to visit people. But it's important for the people on the inside. Most of the activity that I've heard about in North Carolina has been around people on the outside, calling or sending in letters and airing their grievances in that way, trying to put pressure on administration. There was a pretty amazing action. Let's see, was this like 3 weeks ago? Let me look up a thing really fast. Well, okay. In the Gainesville area in so-called Florida, there were some pretty active protests after 2 longtime abolitionist activists, Karen and Rebecca, were killed in a car accident. They had probably 40 or 50 years worth of experience working around prison issues between the 2 of them. And it's had a very big impact on people inside and outside. Like I've talked personally to people from the UK, from all over the US, inside and outside, who have been in contact with them and who are getting support from them. And there was a Fight Toxic Prisons and I think Florida Abolition, which formerly was an IWOC chapter in Gainesville, both helped to coordinate a pretty strong protest at one of the facilities in the Gainesville area that led to a number of, I think, about 10 arrests of people on the outside, just trying to escalate, sort of going onto the property and saying, look, like, people are literally dying on the inside and the outside, just to ameliorate the situations that you're operating. They don't care about the staff. They just, like, it seems like a commonality among prison administrators around the country, much like the government in general, is to try to get this thing to pass by as fast as possible, spend as little money in the meantime, and then afterwards say, oh, we had no idea that people were going to be dying in these numbers. Oops, too late, crowd immunity, So but as far as protests in North Carolina, I mean, I know that a lot of places around the country, as has been a thing for the last 12 years or so, are going to be having New Year's Eve protests, like noise demos outside of jails and prisons. I think it's going down as a list of those that are called out for and made public already. So I'm sure that people are going to be participating in that way. Um, yeah, that's
Yeah.
mostly what I know.
So, for folks out there, you are tuned to Fifth Estate Live, which comes to you every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern, and goes out on the Facebook pages of Popular Resistance, Cable Community Radio, and elsewhere. And you can find it in podcast form at fifthestate.org, where you can also subscribe to the Fifth Estate magazine. The I just from my own like experience, I guess, without getting into any details, it seems that cell phones snuck into prisons make a massive difference in the world, and without them, I mean, it's hard to imagine what even less we would know about the horrors that are going on in this country and throughout the planet in prisons and or horrible dungeons all over the world. I just wonder if you know, without endangering anybody in particular, if you just want to talk generally about this concept of communication and how people can try to communicate, uh,
Sure.
not necessarily how to sneak a cell phone into a prison, but I mean anything on this subject. It just seems like they're so cut off, and then they're not allowed to have cell phones. But then when there is one in there, that's when when we find out about something that's going on, it seems like there's a cell phone involved.
Mm-hmm. So a few things, and actually, I should have mentioned this earlier. And I'm glad that you brought this up. So back in, I hope I don't get the dates wrong. I think in 2010 there were massive strikes in Georgia prisons in the south of the U.S. Based around terrible conditions and based around convict labor. And that was sort of the crux of the argument that a lot of prisoners who were going on strike were working with, was that you are extracting our labor. This has basically become the 13th Amendment argument that a lot of abolitionists and prison movements have been focusing on in the last few years, which is basically that the 13th Amendment that officially ended slavery in the United States after the Civil War has a clause in it that allows for the incarceration and forced working of people that have been duly convicted of a crime. As Michelle Alexander very clearly points out in the New Jim Crow, excuse me, it's been a while since I read it. You can see a direct lineage
Again,
between. Oh, sorry.
which became a bestseller again after
Yeah.
the killing of George Floyd. Yeah.
Yeah. You can clearly see a lineage, much like people point to the lineage between slave catching patrols in the United States and modern policing. You can see a direct correlation between chattel slavery, where private individuals owned other human beings for profit and the government was able to tax them, transferring into the public ownership of human beings through racialized policing and criminal justice system. So in the South, where slavery basically turned to sharecropping, the black codes and things like that were put on the books that criminalized black folks in general, or not specifically being at work at the time when they have an interaction with law enforcement of some sort, being viewed as ne'er-do-wells or as taking up public space, and this like puritanical Christian sense of we need to put these people to work for their betterment so that they develop good European skills and mindsets towards work. That was the argument, right? Is that black folks weren't, if they weren't working for white people, basically they weren't working, and their existence didn't matter. So the criminal justice system was turned to start arresting, criminalizing, incarcerating black bodies and having them do public infrastructure projects. There's large parts of downtown Asheville, where all the tourists love to come, that have been, were literally built by slaves, by formerly enslaved black folks who were convict leased labor. Same with a lot of the railroads around here. And when it's not and like another terrible outcome of different, not worse, but outcome of that sort of scenario too is just that the state is willing to allow tons of folks to die doing backbreaking labor, blowing up a hillside, or laying track or whatever, because they're not individually paying for these people as chattel slaves like the slave owners before them would have. Both are terrible, but a continuation of that. So in 2010, massive strikes in Georgia prisons, cell phones getting in through corrupted guards who just wanted to make a little pay on the outside because they didn't have good unions, because the South doesn't like unions, and like fuck a screw, excuse the language. But yeah, but the guards were being treated terribly, and so they were trying to make a little money on the side. A couple of years later, I think 2013, and I could be getting this wrong, Free Alabama movement rose up, and Free Alabama movement and the related projects in other states, like there's an Ohio one, there's an Illinois one, there's Mississippi, are inside-outside coalitions of prisoners. They're prisoner-led, where prisoners, through the use of cell phones, have been able to communicate with each other, have been able to get out to their family and organizers on the outside, their church communities, whatever, images, video of the terrible situations that they're suffering from, and trying to bring about economic strikes on the outside. Sometimes it's meant that facilities have been taken over for short periods of time and riots have occurred, but that's not usually Free Alabama movement. Their idea, very much based on Michelle Alexander's idea, of is to reform the system, to destroy that bondage, that line of continuation between chattel slavery and modern day slavery. And most of their work is on education and work stoppages. They've called for the month of January for a boycott of the prison industries in Alabama. And you can look them up by just searching Free Alabama Movement in any search engine. But that includes companies that are doing work with prisons that are using prison labor, such as McDonald's, Burger King, excuse me, like making their patties there, Victoria's Secret using prison labor to sew stuff. There's lots of companies, like airline companies, have been using call centers that are based in prisons for years. But they've got more information at that, as well as boycotting the internal communication methods like JPay, which runs the music services in a lot of prisons around the country, but also facilitates the email and news services and the little electronic tablets that prisoners get news over, or listen to their music over. GTL is another company in a lot of states that they have a monopoly on the phone services. But yeah, so another thing on this topic of cell phones and the importance of cell phones, I have the impression that there's an organization called the Jailhouse Lawyers Speak. Through the nationwide prison strikes, they've developed and organized, mostly in the U.S. South, to coordinate protests, to share information, to get it out, and to help speak on behalf of prisoners who don't have a voice in society in general. In 2018, issues had been boiling up around, and again, I'm sorry if I'm getting the dates wrong, around McCormick Correctional in central northern South Carolina. They're just terrible situations there. A lack of access to the outside. At one point, the prison put metal shutters over all of the windows and closed off all of the natural light from getting into the prison. South Carolina was also home to, along with other states, what are they called? Gladiator fights being set up by guards to pit either rival factions within the prison against each other. That's mostly what it was. There was just an uprising a couple of days ago at McCormick where 2 pods of the 4 housing pods were taken over by prisoners. There was communication coming inside and outside saying look, this is what we're protesting about. This is we've got 4 guards that we're holding hostage. They released the guards unharmed. And as I understand, there were a number of escapes. The last I heard was before the South Carolina police and state troopers were going to show up and they were given the right to use lethal force. But I don't think we could have heard the voices of prisoners if not for the fact that they had cell phones. I think that the U.S. government learned a lot was it 92 when the Lucasville uprising happened? in Ohio when Muslim prisoners protesting the forced use of an alcohol-based swab to test for tuberculosis were ignored by the warden, who just wanted his will to be followed, even though the prisoners had proof that, like, A, this is haram for us as Muslims. Here's some scripture about it. And B, here's a method that doesn't include alcohol that other prisons in Ohio have access to that costs as little or less for testing. Here's a reasonable approach. Can we please find an outcome to this? And rather than allowing for that outcome, the warden, King Arthur, decided to push through on that. That led to the Muslim prisoners taking guards hostage, and other factions within rising up to sort of like quell the violence that was starting to happen, the violence between different sets and also between individual prisoners trying to get their vengeance on each other for past wrongs. So, like, the prisoners had access to some degree to the news and were able to get news out. We would have heard a lot more about this if not for the fact that the Waco assault was happening at the same time, and that took all the news coverage. But it did kind of, sort of building off of Attica before it, show this way forward of, like, prisoners taking control of the facility, trying to make a direct connection to the outside and appeal to the humanity, saying that this is an unjust situation that we're being kept in. Cell phones are one of those technologies that allows for prisoners to actually get around all of the rules that the administrations put up to sort of hide the pain and the torture that's going on behind bars. I think it's, like, terribly important, and of course they're going to try to block it.
Yeah. And speaking of news coverage, I'm a news junkie, and I have not heard anything about the South Carolina prison uprising that you're talking about just in the past few days.
Yeah, I'm happy to, being an abolitionist who's involved in anarchist Black Cross work, uh, prisoners inside and outside communicate about that sort of stuff. So it's the biggest thing that I've heard about in quite a while. And I'm happy to send you more information about it afterwards. I know that there were a few articles on some South Carolina news sites about it. I know I listen to Democracy Now! Most days. I haven't heard it mentioned on there, for instance. But
No, I listened to that, and also, lots of other stuff. I mean, Google alerts that they're keeping me posted on all sorts of things, and then of course, yeah, BBC and NPR and Radio Deutsche Welle. And I mean, just I've heard nothing about this, but that's not unusual. You need to follow the right anarchist Twitter account if you want to know what's going on in the prisons. I think sometimes, yeah, that's
and actually, that's a good point. Like, if you do follow Jailhouse Lawyers Speak on Twitter, like, that was one of the breaking points of where that news was getting out, and they were communicating with, for instance, with tons of abolitionists, from communists to anarchists to Christians to all sorts of other folks that focus on getting rid of this abhorrent system that's around us. But following Jailhouse Lawyers Speak and following Free Alabama Movement are two ways to get direct information from prisoners who have snuck in cell phones and their immediate supporters.
great. What was I just going to ask you about? The reparations in Asheville. Talk about this. I mean, it just, from afar, without knowing the details about this, what's going on with the Asheville City Council. I just from my own experience of Asheville, it's been just so tremendously gentrified over the past 20 years that it's completely unrecognizable. Not that it was, not that it should necessarily return to its to its redneck roots, but I mean, it was a scary place in the 80s when I first went to Asheville as a teenage hippie. I felt lucky to leave that town alive, actually. But it's not like that now, and it's a scary place in a lot of other ways, like completely unaffordable to live in for the average person, for example. And I just wonder, how does this reparations idea factor in when you're talking about such a gentrified place as Asheville?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, when I think when I moved here in 2009, the Black population was like 14 or 15%. I saw a presentation by Bell Hooks where she ended up quoting that number. And at the moment, I think it's less than 10%. Like we've seen a steady decline of Black residents of Asheville.
Because of the cost of housing primarily.
Partially that. And I think also partially because of, at least in the Burton Street neighborhood in West Asheville, there's it's a neighborhood that has a large proportion of Black ownership of houses, as opposed to renters, which a lot of working class folks are. And there's a highway expansion project that's been in the works for a couple of decades that would demolish a lot of that neighborhood. So I think between the cost of living,
they've been doing that for like 70 years, making new highways to demolish Black neighborhoods, but it's still going on.
Yeah. It's a longstanding tradition. Where I'm from in Northern California, I remember hearing about an Italian neighborhood that had a highway driven right through the middle of it to get the Italians to move away from downtown Santa Rosa. So I mean, it's a longstanding American tradition. So the timing of that statement, Asheville is a city that is very much interested in its appeal to the wider public. It presents itself as a very queer-friendly, social justice-y place that is safe for people to visit.
A lot like Portland, incidentally.
Yeah. And a lot like Portland, it has a history of pushing out the Black populations in the north and northeast and like other parts of the city, right?
Yeah.
So except that rather than Portland, I'm not sure about with Portland here. One thing that changed since the 1980s was the huge amount of money that was going into the county-based tourism board. The city and the county have been putting money into that so that they can spend large amounts of money advertising the city and sort of building up a name for itself in tourist guides and stuff like that and on websites. And that chatter has in part produced, and the fact that this area has historically been a place where tourists have been drawn to, whether it be the hot springs just north of here in Madison County, or the mountain air and like woodchuck fat based remedies that were being marketed in the late 1800s for folks with tuberculosis. There were a bunch of tuberculosis hospitals up here. The baseball team that's here is a minor league team that's been around since the 1800s, and it's been called the Tourists the whole time. But so the city has been able to sort of reformulate itself after the end of after a bunch of the industry basically left and deindustrialization in the 1970s and 80s. Okay, so
yeah, I like the background. This is excellent. Yeah. A good thorough answer. I love it. Yeah, but
you could call it ranting if you want, but that's
no.
But so yeah.
Well, you do have a balaclava on, and incidentally, you're already creating a fashion statement online. There's somebody who I can see comments, and incidentally, if anybody is watching this live and wants to comment, I can see your comments. And somebody said that they are now going to wear a balaclava at every talk they organize from here on out.
Make sure you wear one with the mouth part covered, though, because this kind of defeats the purpose of not spreading COVID.
Yeah, it's not a very good COVID-friendly balaclava at this in this particular form.
Mike, though. But so basically, Asheville, I think that. So when the uprising was felt this summer here, you saw the highways get taken over by crowds, like multiracial, youth-led and Black-led crowds, for the first time that I've heard of since the mid-90s when the Klan came to town and tried to march in the city, which they haven't been back, thank goodness. But so, it was a mixed bag, but people definitely came out, showed their power. Parts of the downtown tourist area were like pretty well demolished after police incited folks by using heavy use of chemical munitions, rubber bullets, batons, lots of injuries. So they were trying to basically like clear downtown so that business could operate. They declared a curfew for safety or whatever over the city. However, it didn't extend to West Asheville. There were tons of restaurants and bars that were still open. It was just the downtown area where people were protesting and pushing back on the cops. The ACLU threatened to sue the city of Asheville, along with a bunch of other cities that declared these very unconstitutional, basically First Amendment free zones And this promise of reparations was basically, spun out as a PR move, as far as I'm aware. They have removed a couple of statues due to prolonged protest, a couple of monuments to Confederate soldiers, or to Zebulon Vance's monument downtown, the former governor of North Carolina and a slave owner. His obelisk has been covered up while the city and county debate about whose fault it is that it's there and whose responsibility it is to move it. Seen any follow through on the reparations, and after a little bit of time passed, what I did hear come out was specificity of, we're going to choose businesses to give money to. That the idea of like building like the black bourgeoisie up a little bit, and that it would filter down to the rest of the black population. So I haven't really heard anything that tells me that the city is really serious about it. I think that probably they put out as a way of distracting from the fact that they had been using heavy chemical munitions, like lots of tear gas, lots of rubber bullets and pepper spray and batons on people. And especially right after they destroyed the medic tent, you can see pictures. I don't think, do I? It'd be nice if I had my water bottle here, because there's a nice sticker on it of APD cop like looking like this at a camera and stabbing a bunch of water bottles, because that's what they did when they destroyed the medic tent that we had set up downtown to deal with all the chemicals. But yeah, so I think it's just a spin. I don't think it's real.
It's spin, and it's I mean, it's what I figured, but it's very interesting to get your lowdown on what's been going on in Asheville, because although I would have assumed that everything you describe was happening in Asheville, I believe this is the first time I've actually heard anybody talk about the protests in Asheville, or even talk about the police response to protests, which of course sounds identical to the police response to protests all over the country, of course, including here in Portland. But the thing is that if you're a regular listener to corporate media, as you know I am, because I want to know what they're talking about, it's important, then you will have heard about the reparations, and you will have heard nothing about the tear gas in Asheville.
That's how they want it.
Yeah. And of course, here in Portland, you'll have heard that the mayor, who we call Tear Gas Ted, is some kind of a progressive, who stands up to the president. That's how they want to paint his image.
Well, you're in an anarchist jurisdiction now, right, Commissar?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. This is an anarchist jurisdiction. Yeah. Yeah, if only it were. I wrote a song on the subject. Lots of good material out there. You recently did a episode related to gig workers, and I wonder if you have any particular thoughts on the dire situation for gig workers during the pandemic, or just in general. And I don't know what's going on with gig worker organizing, but you were talking with folks organizing a gig worker union in England. Were you, or somebody else?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So recently, PM Press in the UK and in the US published Angry Workers book, Angry Workers Collective, Class Power on 0 Hours.
Great.
I didn't say it.
Excellent.
I do not make any money off of this, but
yeah, does anybody at PM Press. If they're not, I mean, they're paying the rent, but that's if you can do that, then that's impressive.
Mm-hmm. And so it's a couple of I guess anti-state communists, anti-authoritarian communists with a lot of Marxist influence, talking about their 7 years organizing in West London, and most of the industries that they were working in were the 0 hour contracts, basically, where you sign up through a labor agency, they get you in touch with the company, you're not promised any certain amount of hours per week, so they could cut you down to nothing and you'd still be considered to be employed there. So gig workers, slightly different, I guess, than the US, and just sort of different methods of attempting to agitate among the coworkers to figure out like what folks want, to address specific scenarios that many of them, for instance, as immigrants, were facing in terms of crooked landlords, or bosses just using that as a threat for deportation of like, if you speak up, you will lose this job, and therefore you'll lose your right to a visa in this country. Um, so it wasn't. I mean, I guess we talked a bit in the conversation about how COVID has changed the scenario for that, but it's as far as gig organizing now goes, I would love to learn more because I am woefully uneducated about it. I know it's a terribly dangerous thing to do, especially right now. I have a lot of friends that are working in those sort of jobs, but I think it seems pretty hopeless, especially with like California passing the proposition, the voter led proposition that would not allow um, for workers for, I think, one of the quote unquote ride sharing apps. I think Uber, to be able to be viewed as being employees of the company. Instead, they're
Yeah.
still being viewed as independent contractors. And that, while I don't think NLRB, like national labor stuff, is like labor laws are not revolutionary, and they're not going to lead to anything but maybe the slower giving away of our labor for a pittance. It's still like crappy when it's not there, at least as
Yeah,
like a foothold.
that's for sure.
But yeah.
And talk about the another thing you did an episode on recently involved the activities around eviction response, eviction defense, and I know I mean there's a lot of that going, a lot of activities going on around that here in Portland and many other parts of the country, and the I think many of us are waiting for or trying to organize and prepare for the what the business press usually refers to as the tsunami of evictions that they are anticipating. Although, of course, whether it happens or when it happens or how bad it's going to be is going to depend on national and state government actions and whether they happen or not, and to what degree. But can you talk about those activities around your neck of the woods?
Sure. That was my co-host William conducted this interview with folks from Heads Up in Durham, which is an eviction defense group. And I think, just to say, it's already happening. Like it, I think expecting, I think all of us kind of expect there to be some mass wave that we can react to and sort of pin our hopes to, like, enough people will say, this is the final straw. This is like enough. This is too much. But it's already happening. There's so many people, for instance, who were involved in the defenses, the squat defenses and park defenses in Philly, for instance, that had lost their housing during COVID. Um, that it's a slow boil. But so basically, Durham folks had produced this guide that I think they might have finally published, like a final edition. Their stuff can be found at Can't Pay Won't Pay Durham. That's DURM.org. And their eviction defense handbook basically talks about how one can go about building a campaign where you are, how to organize with other tenants, how to find out who's renting from what landlords, what properties they own, where potential leverage might be pressed against those landlords in their decision, how to do the research about like who owns what properties, and how to put together meetings. Yeah, I mean that's basically what I can say about the interview. It was an interesting interview, but it was mostly just, here's a skill set. It's like a series, a set of tools that we've put together. How do we move forward on that? We've spoken over the summer with folks in the Woodlawn Tenants Union in Chicago also about some of the organizing that they've done. And there's a lot of overlap in the way that these defense situations are talked about, except I guess in a larger city, when you've got apartment buildings, you've got one big landlord for one building and maybe a couple within a few blocks that you can talk to everyone and get everyone together and say, look, we've got a common enemy around this. They're going to do this to all of us, as opposed to Durham, which, has apartments, but it's mostly, I think, landlords owning individual houses and people kind of like separated in that way. It's a lot harder to coordinate.
Isn't it? And that's part of the complexity of organizing around this whole question, because it's one of these forms of small time capitalism that millions of people are able to engage in as landlords. And although like my landlord here is a massive corporation that owns 100 building up and down, up and down the coast, which just makes it morally so easy to hate them and organize against them and have no problems at all. But internally, but it's a very rife and complex thing to take on, especially in places where you don't have those big apartment complexes, isn't it? I don't know how much you've been involved with that stuff, but
not so much. Most of the mutual aid work that I've done here has been about food distribution.
Can you talk about that? What's been happening with that?
Sure. So let's see. Anarchists for the last couple of years had been talking about. Okay, so because we're based in the Southeast, there's a lot of anarchist infrastructure that's been building up to respond to disasters, to like natural disasters, to hurricanes and floods. Because we're right like so close to the Gulf, and because so many storms pass along the like southeastern seaboard of the so-called US. So based off of like the work that Scott Crow and other folks were doing in New Orleans after Katrina, in the last, I guess probably since like 2012, disaster response model to some degree of I'm forgetting the name of the collective in New Orleans. Do you recall?
Oh, Common Ground.
Common Ground. Thank you. Sort of trying to reproduce some of that style, get people from stabilized places to come in and help facilitate people fixing up their houses, distributing medical good, medical care, food, clothing, like just sort of taking our resources, pulling them up in stabilized regions, bringing them to destabilized regions, trying to take lead from local folks that are affected by these problems and help to build up mutual aid infrastructure that hopefully outlasts the immediate disaster of the weather situation and can last into the disaster of racialized capitalism. So around the Southeast, a lot of anarchists and anti-authoritarians have been engaged, and socialists have been engaged in coordinating fundraising for medical gear, getting together medical professionals, training people up who aren't medical professionals to be able to do first aid, and then distributing these into flood zones, into hurricane paths, and trying to, where basically the government in a lot of cases will pull back and not actually distribute anything, will kind of let the waters recede before giving any sort of aid. We'll go out and do mutual aid. I haven't actually, I'll say we, meaning anarchists and anti-authoritarians, I haven't gone out to any of those places, but so using that idea of mutual aid disaster relief and some of the networks that are affiliated with that locally in Asheville, for instance, as the pandemic started moving along, we had a group that started planning for housing eviction. I'm not sure, or like eviction defense. I'm not sure how they've gotten with that. We interviewed them, right, I think back in March or April. And then another element of the mutual aid, once the protests came up, is the ABC and some folks doing started a jail support collective, basically, that's working towards having a roving bail fund. But so I've been working with that a little bit. Mostly what I've been working with is Asheville Survival Program. It's named after the Black Panther Party's program for survival pending revolution. It's an anti-authoritarian project. Not everyone who's involved in it is anarchists. We've basically at this point got two parts, one of which supplements the ability of nonprofits in the area to give service to homeless folks and distribute clothing, hand warmers, coffee, like hot coffee and food, to houseless folks who can't go into day shelters because of the COVID restrictions. And then I've also been involved to some degree in trying to help apply pressure on the city to open up hotel rooms for especially the more prone to illness folks that are on the streets, the elders and people with pre-existing conditions. And then the other side.
Is the city doing that?
Is
the city doing that? Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's at one point there were 80 hotel rooms that were being purchased with money from FEMA by the city. It's not perfect, but all these hotels end up getting so much money from the local government that it seems like they should be giving back to the community by opening up hotel rooms. So it's nothing like what happened in Minneapolis, where people actually like autonomously took over a space. But yeah, so I think there are about 60 to 80 hotel rooms that are housing homeless folks at the moment. And I think month by month, those could go away. But at the moment, they've been sustaining since the middle of summer. Let's hope they keep through the winter as the snows come. And so the other part of ASP is a food distribution spot that we've rented a spot. We're distributing groceries to people, distributing diapers, distributing sanitary goods. We get donations online through, we put out the word through social media, solicit money. We also have some donation spots where people drop groceries around various stores in the county. We pick those up, bring them back. We've changed our pattern of how we deal with the material before distributing it. Like at first, when we didn't know what COVID was and how it was transmitted, we made a thing of making sure that everyone's groceries were in a plastic bag for at least 3 days, and then a plastic bag around that. So when we went to deliver them to folks that were housebound, we would rip off the outer bag. They could take the inner bag that had their stuff on the inside, and their stuff on the inside should have been like, what if the virus was on it? It should have died by that point. It seems like groceries aren't so much a vector at the moment, but we still do that sort of stuff, or ASP is still doing that for some people that feel that they're in a special danger of infection. And then there's also like direct food distribution from that spot to local folks in public housing.
And ASP stands for what's that again?
Asheville Survival Program.
Great. Well, it's been such a pleasure talking with you.
Mutual.
Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. I will hopefully see you again soon.
Hopefully.
Take care.
Take care.
Till then. And thanks, everybody, for listening to this discussion with Bursts with the Final Straw Radio Podcast Collective in Asheville, North Carolina. This has been another episode of Fifth Estate Live, which comes to you every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern. And you can find the archived editions of the program in both video and podcast form if you go to fifthestate.org. Or look up This Week with David Rovics wherever you get your podcasts. And tomorrow on my program that I do on Wednesdays generally called Discussions with David, I will be interviewing Graciela Monteagudo, a brilliant anarchist and college professor at the University of Massachusetts from Argentina, who has a lot of alternate perspective on Maradona and other recent developments in her home country. Okay, everybody, thanks for listening. And remember, mutual aid will get us through. Don't pay the rent. Trust your neighbors. Talk to you soon.